okay, I get to, 15% body fat. Oh, doesn't feel like I had the feeling I wanted. Maybe
Yeah.
I need to get to 10%. Maybe I
Yeah.
need to get to 8%. I think that's one of the biggest fallacies is you kind of reach these goalposts that you told yourself was going to make you happy. Half hippie, half corporate man. This is the guide to the ultimate version of you and how you can get what you want out of life without sacrificing your peace. But then when you get there and you don't switch your perspective to realize all these feelings are actually internally created, then what's very common to do is to say, oh, okay, if I get more of this, maybe then I will be happy. In today's episode, we talk about the pros and cons of each archetype and how you can combine the two to create the life you want while feeling good inside. We also mention how the hippie archetype is mostly misunderstood by the corporate world and how the corporate world is misunderstood by the hippie archetype. So if you can be one of the few people who can integrate the two, this is how you unlock an unfair advantage. Welcome to the Data Driven Actualization podcast. Today we're going to talk about why being half hippie and half corporate man is the formula for your next level self. Dr. Namer, please tell us more about how we came to this subject.
So this came up from a number of discussions and experiences over the years that we've had between going to retreats in Colorado that maybe were one end of the spectrum, and then I think our own upbringing and experiences of our own cultures that kind of stress the corporate man side more, as well as during my studies, seeing this come up in the difference almost between engineering and philosophy. And I think throughout our journey, we kept seeing the pendulum swing from one end to the other, where we'd see ourselves in a very hipster setting and we'd see, okay, there's some values here that are useful, but then there's some shortcomings. But then you and I think both having been down the corporate ladder, so to say, we looked at that and we saw, well, there's some utility here, but there's also shortcomings. And so in the quest to kind of transcend and include, we really worked on how we can integrate the values of both of these in a very healthy way. And that's what kind of motivated us to make this podcast today.
Yeah, I think if you're someone who wants to achieve things in the world, but you also want to do it in a way where, your internal world is helping you get to the outcome, then this is a very valuable podcast. Because I remember when I was in the achievement phase of life and I had just finished college, I was building my business in Mexico, and I went to the city called Playa del Carmen. And it was this very interesting mix of people who were building their businesses online, but also a lot of people who were a little bit older in most cases, who had been through the corporate route and who were just doing healing work, energy ceremonies, cacao ceremonies, all this stuff, which at the time, from the perspective that I was seeing all of this, just looked like an absolute waste of time, because I was thinking to myself, dude, you only have 8 hours a day to work. Let's say if you're working more, you have 10 hours, right? You're just wasting your time sitting there, not doing anything, staring at a wall. How is that going to help? And then from that time, I evolved into including meditation, energy practices, a lot of different things in my own practice. And now looking back, that way of thinking feels almost a little bit silly, because you're negating the value of looking at your internal world.
Yeah. And then I think for me on the flip side, it was having a similar journey around extreme burnout, where I think for 4 or 5 times in a row, I thought, okay, I gave this activity my all. I have barely anything left in the tank. And then a new challenge would come up. And then I'd be like, all right, time to do this. And then this happened 4 or 5 times, where I thought every time I was thinking, now I'm running on empty, but then a new challenge would come up and I had to do it. And that led to a very extreme burnout. And so that made me look at things from the other way of, okay, how can we build things sustainably? What about enjoying myself? And exploring that end as well around things such as meditation and intimacy with oneself and self-love, I also felt like it was often being taken to an extreme, where when I found myself deep in these practices, I actually caught myself thinking, you know what, as good as these feel, I really miss that drive that I had when I was in that achievement stage, because I felt like I was almost getting a little apathetic, where I'd wake up and I'd say, well, I can just feel good anyway. So why does this outcome matter? And then I just didn't care about how things went. And over the past few years, I really miss waking up and feeling that drive. And that led me to think about, okay, how can we feel that drive? But when I was younger, I felt that drive also with a lot of fear. So there was a lot of motivation, but then there was the constant, what if I fail?
Yeah, it was all generated from the shadow.
Yeah. Versus I wanted to still feel that drive and also feel that peace.
Right.
Knowing that, okay, this is something I'm very inspired to do, but also if it doesn't work out, that is fine, doesn't make me any less of a person. And that, looking at it like that, I also saw a connection between my research, where I realized a lot of times it's easy to prioritize practical action versus taking a step back and really asking, okay, what are we actually trying to solve for? And then oftentimes people think of these as two distinct things. One's like engineering, one's philosophy. But then in my own research, I realized actually they're a lot more intricately connected.
Right.
Because the more epistemology and philosophy you understand, the more clarity you have on, well, what is my engineering actually doing? So that makes you a better engineer. But then when you are also a philosopher or someone who does things like epistemology, seeing how things are done in practice can give you really good reality checks. And that was a similar kind of concept that I tried to integrate here, where what can we take that's very useful about being the corporate man, and what's useful about being the stereotypical hippie, and how can we integrate both of them in a healthy way.
So what do you think about kind of going into the archetype and then defining pros and cons, and from there building a connection?
Yeah, I'd say,
what would be the archetype of the corporate man, since I know you enjoy watching your Suits, Billions. You have quite a bit of familiarity in this context.
Yeah. So for me, the corporate man, the archetype is more about having clear goals, very clear aspirations, and prioritizing achieving your goals over feeling good. Right. So it's almost like, yes, feeling good is important, but if you ask me, which one am I willing to sacrifice? Achieving your goals or feeling good? Feeling good's going out of the window like instantly, right? So to me, that's kind of the fundamental of the corporate man, is that it's about achieving goals that you set for yourself. And again, these don't have to be selfish. Like, I think it's often very common for people who are not corporate men to just mislabel them as like, oh, you have goals, that's selfish. Really, you can have goals around making impact and touching the lives of people. So it's more about having a clear set of goals, clear purpose, and prioritizing achieving those goals over feeling good about yourself and about things on the way.
Right. Especially, I guess, at a moment to moment basis, like
Yeah,
understanding that the journey will have its ups and downs, and then seeing, like, okay, if I have this goal that I'm working towards, this impact, or even things for myself, right? It's not more spiritual to not make money, or it's not
yeah,
more spiritual to not be in shape. Because I think a lot of people also see all these like gurus and spiritual figures, and especially, let's say, you were to join a Buddhist monastery, right? Then you would be fed based on people's donations, which is not the best quality of food.
not the most
So
anabolic.
yeah, so you could look at, these monks, and if you put a lot of golden projections around, this is what peace looks like, and you may be like, oh, maybe I should sacrifice everything and then just prioritize peace. But even that is a should in itself, and I think the positives in the corporate man is just seeing like external impact and external things matter.
Yeah,
They're not the end all be all, which I think sometimes people forget from that perspective, but they're very important. And in a way, we talked about different things so far in the podcast, but if you have more money, if you're in better shape, if you have deeper relationships with people you care about, your life does get better. Now, the thing is, what's your definition of your life getting better, which is what we're going to explore in this podcast as well.
yeah. And just a quick note to kind of wrap up the corporate man, this idea of feeling peace and fun on a moment to moment basis. It kind of
Mm-hmm.
was when I was really training for upcoming matches. I do this interval of on the bicycle where
Mm-hmm.
my heart rate would be like 195, 196,
Right.
200 for extended periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
And in those moments, I think of every insulting thing anyone had ever said to me. And that's the only way I could dissociate from the fact that my legs literally felt like they were on fire.
Right.
And so, in that moment, was that fun? No. Looking back, would I do it in that circumstance? Would I do it again 10 out of 10? And that
Mm-hmm.
journey was very, very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's not that the corporate man doesn't prioritize fun. In many
Mm-hmm.
ways, it's almost the cognitive processes and the way fun is defined
Mm-hmm.
is, as well as peace is defined, is just different.
Right. Yeah.
And would you like to give the overview of the archetype of the hippie?
Yeah, I think the hippie is an archetype that's very much misunderstood, but I think part of that is also at that stage of development, people go on so many extremes
Yeah,
that usually the ones that stand out as experiences are people who you just think like, what's going on with this guy or what's going on with this girl, right? But I think, the positive sides of the whole hippie culture in general, where these are usually people who have achieved some things in the world and who have come to the conclusion that, hey, I've got some of the things I need that I wanted. I reached to that end goal, whatever that was for me. But then I realized this end goal doesn't really change the way I feel about myself. So there's a deeper emphasis of exploration of the internal self, like how I feel about something. Sure, I can optimize my communication or charisma, and maybe I use a strategy like, oh, when you say I'm curious before you ask a
yeah,
question, people open up more, but how do I feel about it? So these are the ways in which authenticity, intimacy, connection start becoming the driving values rather than ambition, drive, getting to the end goal at any outcome, right? Because in the corporate world, sometimes you can, again, part of this is shadow as well, but sometimes you can burn relationships just getting to the outcome you want. For example, if you watch a lot of Alex Hormozy, actually, right? He has a short on why he doesn't go home for the holidays. And he's
uh,
like, yeah, my family never supported my goals. And when I go back home, people see me as my former self, which from a corporate perspective is very valuable, because if it's not helping him reach his goals, then he's like, no, I don't want this relationship. Now, what the hippie would see there is, well, you have a connection to your family, you have a connection to your community, and you have all this money anyways, right? So at the end of your life, when you're going to die, you don't keep this money, but the relationships you have actually lead you to a fulfilling life. And I think that's where that archetype really, really shines. And I think another part of it, which can be quite triggering for people, is just the level of open mindedness. Because the one thing about that hippie archetype is you can tell them the craziest thing about yourself or your world, and they'll be like, oh, that's cool, man. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
I accept you for who you are.
Yeah, I accept you for who you are.
Yeah.
Which, in the right context with the right people, can be very healing, because that's not something that exists in the corporate world, right?
Yeah.
If you're like, hey guys, I hit 10% of the KPIs for the last month, they're like, dude, you're fired.
Yeah.
Get out of here. Which, again, from a greater perspective, that can make sense and it's nothing personal. But I think the perspective of the person who's a bit of a hippie, or who's, I'd say, in a more, I guess, in a different way, I would term that more as like focused on the internal self and that level of intimacy with his own self or her own self, but also with people around him. That's where things like community and self love really come in to perspective, and people start to see, wow, this is really important. And I think that's why in most people's development, that comes through a very hectic event. Like,
Yeah.
people either get everything they want, they turn 40, they realize half of their life is over. Like, okay, what's going on? What did they do? They quit their corporate career, they move to Mexico, they move to Thailand, they do an ayahuasca ceremony, or people take mushrooms for once in their life, and then suddenly they have these types of experiences. And again, I'm not saying you have to do those things to have that experience. For me, it didn't happen that way, and they're completely not necessary. But I do think that's why that switch happens in such a hectic way, because
Yeah.
there's almost this sense of grief, right? Where you see, wow, I got all these things I wanted, but then it didn't lead me to exactly where I wanted to go. So you start seeing the deeper intentions behind those goals, and that's where the value comes in.
Yeah. Definitely agree with that, because for me, it was a moment of insane burnout after working at a famous company, kind of
Mm-hmm.
being like, wait, is this what I was aspiring for?
Right.
And then that made the dominoes fall in everything else that I was aspiring for. And then that made me go, oh, well, what is it that I actually want?
Mm-hmm.
And I do really agree with the fact that there is a lot of misunderstanding there, precisely because of the reasons you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
around where I think a lot of times people would probably label us as hippies in many conversations, especially sometimes when we talk about like deconstructing things, or
Yeah, yeah.
if we say, or when we say lines like, oh, well, but at the end of the day, telling someone something is just making a bunch of sounds.
Right.
What's the biggest deal? Which to someone
Mm-hmm.
who doesn't think that way, they're probably like, what have these guys been taking?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's very easy for that to be misunderstood. And I think it's also, given the concepts that are explored at that stage,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy for nuance to be lost, because when you're exploring relativism,
Mm-hmm.
I think something I noticed was a lot of times people will confuse things being relative with things being arbitrary.
Right.
And because of that, a lot of the nuance was lost, and then there's a lot of misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm. So what's the difference there for someone who doesn't grasp that concept
Yeah.
fully? Can you give an
So
example?
I think the example I always like to think of is that um, Newton's famous discovery was, he's sitting at the bottom of the tree and the apple falls on him.
Right.
And it's kind of true that, well, the apple did fall on him, but it is relative to who the observer is, because if the observer
Mm-hmm.
was moving at the same velocity as the apple,
Then the apple is just stagnant.
Yeah, and so depending on your frame of reference,
Mm-hmm.
that is also true. And so this
Mm-hmm.
idea that the truth is relative based on these different frames of reference we have,
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's what relativism is. And I'm sure maybe there's a more rigorous academic definition out there. So,
But that's relative as well. So
yeah.
we're gonna stick with our definition.
And so, really seeing the truth in all these different things. But then at the same time, it's not arbitrary in that if you're claiming about relativism in this scenario, there are certain rules
Mm-hmm.
that kind of govern that. You can't be this, you can't fully set any kinds of background conditions and rules and arrive at any conclusion you want.
Right.
There are
It's
constraints.
not like the apple's gonna fly out of the
Yeah.
atmosphere.
Yeah, it's not like the apple just suddenly turned into 100 apples.
That would be cool.
Yeah, or, and so I think a lot of times that's where the mix up happens, is that people will take relativism, but then almost turn it into a level of arbitrariness.
Mm-hmm.
Where I found that happening sometimes with values, where people were like, my values are equally as important as yours, but
Mm-hmm.
then failing to see that depending on the situation, certain values
Mm-hmm.
were more useful, and that you can't just arbitrarily move things around and say, but this is as valid,
Right.
which in some sense it is, but
It
seeing the
doesn't mean
usefulness.
it's as functional.
Yeah,
Like it can still be valid, but it's not as functional. Like it's kind of like, could I take a car from here to go back to Turkey? I think I could, but is it as functional as taking a flight? Definitely not.
yeah,
So similar to that, right? Some perspectives can still arrive to similar conclusions and they're useful, but which one's more functional? And
yeah,
I think that's something people miss in these types of circles, is just, okay, we all have different opinions and they're all important and they all have value. But at the same time, some opinions are more functional than others to create the reality that we want.
yeah. And, in the interest of showing that we're impartial, it's not like only one side has downsides.
Right.
The corporate world, or clearly, I guess, from both of our experiences, but also,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, more and more reports now that has its downsides as well,
Yeah.
around things like burnout, around things like um, people's happiness around and life satisfaction, people
Mm-hmm.
feeling like maybe they've lived all this life working at a job that
Mm-hmm.
their parents maybe thought them they should get, and then hitting a
Yeah.
certain age in their life where they're really having a bit of an existential crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and then combining that with things like the layoffs we've seen, where it really has felt like the it was done with not a lot of care.
Right.
Because I think, to me, a lot of times it's, if someone's working for me,
Mm-hmm.
it's you take care of them and you show them that you really care about them, and in return they show their care for you by helping you achieve your goals, and it's a very
Right.
much a symbiotic relationship.
Right.
Versus a lot of these layoffs, it's kind of like reading some of the stories about, you find out things are ended because you can no longer swipe into the building.
Yeah. Or log into your email.
Yeah. And so this idea of laying off people the moment things get hard, just
Mm-hmm.
to adjust the bottom line,
Mm-hmm.
those are obviously some very clear downsides of
Mm-hmm.
the pure corporate culture of looking at things.
Right. And I think just the idea of something more will fix it, like whether it's more food at a cultural level, whether it's like more import export, but also at a personal level. Okay, I get to 15% body fat. Oh, doesn't feel like I had the feeling I wanted. Maybe
Yeah.
I need to get to 10%. Maybe I
Yeah.
need to get to 8%. I think that's one of the biggest fallacies, is you kind of reach these goalposts that you told yourself was going to make you happy, which is something we talked about in the last episode. But then when you get there and you don't switch your perspective to realize all these feelings are actually internally created, then what's very common to do is to say, oh, okay, if I get more of this, maybe then I will be happy.
Yeah.
And I've seen people do that a lot when business, right? I had friends who built very, very big businesses. And at the beginning, it was very much about impact. But at some point during the game, they got a little bit caught up with the whole income side of things. Because the thing is, again, another downside, I think, of this simply corporate outlook on life is it's very competition based. And that's good for ambition and drive. But then there's always someone who's going to be better, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're going to be the Michael Jordan of your field, there's always going to be someone who's better. And what will happen is you have this buckets of competition where you climb one bucket and then you jump into the next bucket and you climb that and you climb that and you climb that. And that can get very exhausting. And you can also lose yourself in those buckets, right? You can build a business that makes $50,000 a month, $100,000 a month, $1 million a month, only to realize this was not the business I wanted to build. And I think, some of those insights that I learned looking into others people's lives have been very helpful for me, because back when I was coaching dating, there was a really good trajectory to scale the business. We had a really strong program that was getting amazing results. So if I really wanted to, and if I was in that paradigm, I could have easily scaled to 20, 50, 100K a month. But I realized that's not the game I want to play. And I think that's one of the downsides of the corporate outlook, is they don't see that one of the choices they have is, hey, this is not the game I want to play.
Yeah.
And actually, there's so much value in being able to say that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think along those lines, the other thing I was thinking about was we try and push for goals in the hope that they will make us feel a certain way when we achieve them.
Mm-hmm.
But because we never look inwards, and that this is where I guess the quote unquote the hippie perspective really gave me a lot of insight, was because if you keep your internal world and beliefs fixed, but then you try and achieve more, thinking you're going to eventually feel a certain way once you achieve something, that can often lead to the goalpost just moving and never feeling like there's enough. Even if you become world number one, it's kind of, well, then let's say you're 29 when you're world number one.
Right.
Then you're worried about the next 19-year-old who's up and coming, who could take your throne.
Yeah.
And versus the idea of, well, maybe if we can change the internal world, and then doing more and more leads to a different conclusion and leads to a different feeling. I find it quite similar to something I realized when we're doing a lot of statistics research, was depending on the assumptions you begin with, the same external data can often lead to different conclusions.
Right.
And there's actually like rather hilarious examples of this where you can get just wildly different answers based on what you assume. And even here, it's quite similar, where I think depending on what your internal world is, the same external events can either lead to you chasing down a hole that's kind of endless, or they can be, each external event can be a reason to feel happy and more peace. And the only way you learn to audit your internal world is when you pause and look inwards and kind of look into metacognition or auditing your own cognition.
Right.
Which I don't know if I learned to do using maybe more meditation and shadow work. Maybe there's more other ways to audit your own cognition. I don't know. But that's where like the hippie world was very helpful, because it really allowed me to turn cognition on itself
Right.
As opposed to in the corporate world, it's very easy to assume this is my cognition, this is fixed, and this is reality.
Yeah, this is who I am. Yeah. I think one of the things that's also interesting to explore as a downside of being in the more hippie world, first of all, what you said is very valuable in the sense that you're not just a corporate man or you're not just a hippie. So people who are watching this may be like, oh, I am this or I am this. It's more like you have different parts of yourself, and some of those parts are more developed, and other parts are almost like malnourished. It's kind of like if you go to the gym and you never train legs, right?
Yeah.
But you look like the guy with the chicken
Something
legs.
we're obviously not familiar
Yeah,
with
something we're not familiar
or
with at
guilty of.
all, or guilty of at all. It's not like we did 10 sets of biceps getting ready for this podcast episode. But what happens is there's an imbalance in your body, right? And just like that, you can have an imbalance in your internal world, where if certain parts of you are deriving your behavior, which happens a lot in the corporate man archetype, but also in the hippie archetype. The way archetypes are formed is if one part is really driving the behavior, and that creates a very imbalanced life. Because with the hippie archetype, what happens is, okay, then I need to check in with myself for everything. Okay, I wake up now. Okay, let me check in with myself. And then, like an hour later, you're still checking in with how you're feeling. And then 4 hours later, you just spend time like lying down on the couch, checking in with yourself. And maybe you discovered some things. And maybe this is a phase of life you're in, which is very valid. But if you keep living life from this way for a year, for 2 years, for 5 years, for 10 years, then you can feel as much as you want, but the actions that you take towards yourself don't communicate the love that you may be feeling inside. Because it's also very loving to be able to get out in the world and make money for yourself, to go to the gym for yourself, to have relationships for yourself, because all these things are proven to create a better life for you. And it's also very loving to share the love that you're feeling with other people by doing something meaningful. And I think that's where the downside of the hippie archetype comes in, is it's really easy to get caught up in that feeling without translating it into doing.
Yeah. And so, having kind of explored both of these, how would you recommend people start integrating both of them in
Mm-hmm.
healthy ways?
Yeah, I think so. If you resonate more with the corporate world man archetype, what I would recommend for you to do is to start recognizing the impact between what you think and what you feel with the outcomes that you get. So the way you do that is you can observe what's happening in yourself as you're going about your day-to-day life. And I think that's why this idea of Think and Grow Rich, the book, became very popular,
Right.
right? Because it's all about thinking to create an external outcome, which really resonates with that level of development. So the way you do that is just go throughout your day as you would usually do. And let's say you have a negative emotion. You're feeling anxious, you're feeling doubt, you're feeling like you want to procrastinate, you're feeling burnt out. And then go, okay, what's another way I can think about this? And maybe you have the idea that, cool, I'm going to think about this in the sense that, hey, I'm tired, maybe I need some rest. And after that thought, take the smallest action that actually honors that conclusion. So, okay, maybe I'm not going to rest for an hour, but I'll rest for 10 minutes. Just see how I feel, right? And then you can extrapolate on that difference. Okay, now that I'm rested, how do I feel now? And over time, you can actually experiment with these small practices and verify how you feel, right? Don't take anything we said and believe it blindly, but actually take this practice and verify it. And this is how you get to transform this for your own life. Do you have anything to add on that
Um,
front?
yeah, I'd say when you set goals for yourself, really asking what would achieving this goal mean about myself, like
Mm-hmm.
what you taught me. Because a lot of times when I step back and genuinely ask myself, okay, what would this goal of becoming a professor at a prestigious university mean about me? And
Mm-hmm.
I realized, well, it was so that I could show everyone that you could just be like an average performing student in class who
Mm-hmm.
didn't have as much money as his peers did to go to fancy colleges and still do better than them. And
Mm-hmm.
then when I stepped back and really put this thought process in line, I kind of was like, dude, your friends don't particularly care either. They just like you for who you are.
Right.
Um, and so when you really start to become a bit more aware, and I think it's the same even with, let's say, fitness goals,
Mm-hmm.
it's because it's completely, fitness goals are great. But if you want to get to 7%
Mm-hmm.
body fat, because single digit body fat is that magical number
Mm-hmm.
where women absolutely like you and like you just walk on the street and you're a god amongst men,
Mm-hmm.
um, asking yourself what success with that would mean to you and what's really that feeling you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's completely fine to aspire for material things and things in the external world, but also
Mm-hmm.
doing it very consciously
Mm-hmm.
around what would achieving this mean about myself. I
Mm-hmm.
found was quite useful in knowing when to stop at 5 versus trying to just go for 500 of
Right.
like any, call it, instances of peak experiences.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you're on the other hand, where you're seeing, okay, maybe I am the type of person who's more of that hippie archetype, where I've been watching podcasts like this, really learning, reflecting in myself, but I'm actually starting to see that all this reflection doesn't necessarily translate into my behavior. Or maybe you've been to retreats, right? You felt really good on the retreat, you felt amazing, you felt so seen, you felt so loved, you came back home and everything was the same after a couple of weeks. If you resonate with that, one of the things I would recommend for you to do is to actually recognize how whatever emotion you're feeling when you're by yourself can also be carried out into external actions. So, for example, if you sit with yourself and you really feel love for yourself, how can you expand that emotional state to when you do the dishes, when you make food for yourself, when you clean your house? So, small things at first, small things that don't have very strong triggers. And then you start bringing that emotion into experiences that may have more difficulties. Maybe, you feel really good when you're by yourself, but when you're around people, you get really triggered. You feel like everyone's judging you. You can't really speak for your own mind. Maybe you don't feel safe. You close up. In that moment, I want you to recognize that action of exposing yourself to all these different situations is also a method of healing, right? There is no purpose in feeling very healed on your couch, but the moment you leave your home, you feel like there's all this triggers around you. So that would be my first recommendation, is actually seeing that, okay, how can I take this healing that I'm doing in my own space and I can carry that healing into the day-to-day actions that I do. And actually, the second thing I would recommend is taking some time away from all the energy circles, all the retreats, all the ceremonies that you're going to. Because one thing, again, Namara and I have seen as well, is if you get too sucked into that circle, what happens is you completely lose this idea of hierarchy. So when you try to connect with a regular person, they're like, dude, what's the problem? No, that's not true at all. So you want to understand how culture and beliefs shape everything, but you also want to understand that in the context of still being able to engage in the right ways with people with different cultures, because not everyone's ready to discover their internal parts or to see that this corporate life that they worked so hard for is actually something that's not as important as they think.
Yeah.
So if you go out in the world and you're just preaching this message, you're not actually embodying the principle of having love for all your internal parts, but also for your community. So start seeing your own blind spots as well, in terms of when you preach a principle, but you're not actually embodying that principle. And when you see that, you can also hold that part of you in love and unconditional acceptance, but you realize, okay, I have more work to do for myself before just spreading this message outwards, because I think that's one of the downsides of the hippie archetype is it's like the message is spoken but it's not embodied as
Yeah.
deeply as someone who's a little bit more developed. And there's actually so much energy wasted trying to force this message to other people that can rather be spent building the life that you want.
Yeah. And I guess just to touch a bit more on that point of hierarchies as well, I think one thing that came to my mind was um, this idea of, yes, everything that we say, and this idea of authentic expression and what's acceptable to say and what's not acceptable to say,
Mm-hmm.
um, is in some sense a social construct, but then also being able to see the usefulness of
Right.
that social construct, where there's a reason why we don't just run around saying inappropriate things
Right.
to
There's a
everyone and being
reason
a norm.
we wear clothes when we leave our house, right?
Yeah. Um, and similarly, I think even with the touching on the nuance, it's, it is very easy to say all your achievements are meaningless, which, depending on certain definitions of like the word meaningless,
Mm-hmm.
they are. But then at the same time, if you ask someone who tells you that your achievements are meaningless to give you their house keys, their wallet, and everything this very moment, because it's all meaningless, they're probably not going to,
Mm-hmm.
because then, you know, they're just stranded on the street with nothing.
Right.
Um, and so I think this ties into the idea of constantly doing reality checks.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of my mentors early on, he gave me this line that says, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of also came up when I was learning some bachata and I was just watching YouTube videos.
Right.
And so it helped me with the basic foundation. But obviously, when I went to dance and I actually tried it, I was like, okay, just watching that YouTube video was 10%, a
Mm-hmm.
very necessary 10%, but actually showing up and embodying it,
Mm-hmm.
whole other game. And
Yeah.
just thinking that that 10% that I did by myself was actually the full journey was very short sighted.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even with a lot of these healing works and states, really testing how they hold up in the external world and constantly giving them reality checks is how you can really start to incorporate all the positive qualities of the hippie archetype, because there really are very, very valuable
Mm-hmm.
qualities of it. But then giving it reality checks can really help you combine it with the positive qualities of the corporate archetype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else to end on?
No, that's all from my side.
Cool. If you guys enjoyed this episode, one thing you can do is to actually go into the link down below and download our Data Driven Healing Playbook. We talked about how to embody different archetypes in this episode. And one of the things that gets in the way of that is actually your internal patterns, right? Your unconscious material that keeps you sucked in to a certain way of behavior. And when you release that, what happens is you're able to be more flexible, embodying different parts of yourself. And in that free playbook, we teach you a process on how to identify these blind spots as well as how to let go of them so you can live a life where you're being yourself, but your definition of yourself has expanded way beyond a certain word, like a corporate man or a hippie.
Yeah.
So hope you enjoy this. If you did, drop a like, drop a comment. This is Ege,
This is Numer.
and this is the Data Driven Actualization podcast. See you guys next time.